What I want to do tonight is basically actually I'm going to read a paper which is based upon an essay that I wrote for the catalog of the Derain exhibition, the retrospective exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, which was published only in French and actually in Spanish, but not in English, and probably won't be published in English anytime soon. This is not exactly the paper, but it is based on it. Why don't we start with the first two slides, please? And I can see, okay. Twice in my lifetime, I have seen an upsurge of opinion declaring that painting is dead. The first time was during the mid-1960s, when that declaration was thought by many to have an undeniable historical urgency and was taken quite seriously. That dates me. The second time has been quite recently, but now the pronouncement has had less impact. Perhaps this is because it is now considered to be more of a political position or even a marketing strategy for alternative forms of expression than a serious evaluation of either the current state or future prospects of the art of painting. And perhaps it is also because now, far more than 30 years ago, painting is understood to fulfill a need within human experience that cannot be satisfied otherwise. Although it is difficult to say precisely what that need is, it seems to me that André Derain cuts a most interesting figure in relation to it. On the occasion of his retrospective exhibition last year, I found myself moved to try to situate Derain within two traditions. Within the modern French tradition, which I believe to have produced, or at least provoked, much of the best painting done throughout the world during the past century and a half, and within a more general international tradition, which I think may cast an instructive light on the general situation of French painting during the last 50 years or so. Among significant artists of the 20th century, André Derain is one of the most difficult to place. We see him here at his easel with his family, both stylistically and in terms of his overall achievement. In the standard histories of modern painting, Derain is considered a crucial initiator of Fauve painting, along with Matisse, and I show you Derain's portrait of Matisse on the left and Matisse's portrait of Derain on the left and Derain's portrait of Matisse on the right, done in 1905 at Collioure when they spent the summer there together, the so-called Fauve summer. But after this brief moment, he pretty much drops out of art history, only to reappear somewhat anomalously and very briefly during the 1920s as an eclectic naturalist. In fact, Derain's historical position was considerably more complex, for he was not only considered a crucial participant in Fauve painting, but around 1910 was also considered by many to have played an important role in the development of Cubism, as reflected in these two paintings of 1910. In 1913, for example, Guillaume Apollinaire referred to Derain's Fauve work as, quote, a sort of preamble to Cubism, and still at the origin of this great subjective movement. Apollinaire even went so far as to assert that the Cubism of Picasso was given birth, and this is a direct quote, by a movement that comes from André Derain. A year later, Apollinaire characterized the legacy of Cubism in terms of, quote, two great currents, of which one comes out of the Cubism of Picasso and the other from the Cubism of André Derain. Both come from Cezanne, end quote. As we shall see, the dual role that Cezanne played in relation to advanced painting at the time would turn out to be determining for Derain. Any evaluation of Derain's career is made even more complicated by the fact that during the latter and longer part of it, the years after the First World War, he produced a body of work that seems in large measure to have been a reaction against the essential principles of both Fauve and Cubist painting, as one sees here. This remains a problematical phenomenon that has been characterized in a number of different ways, a few of them flattering. By some, Derain is considered an essentially academic artist who was only briefly and almost despite himself involved with revolutionary art. By others, he is seen as typical of a malaise that has plagued a number of artists during our century who have had a brief moment of glory, then run out of inspiration and been left behind, as it were, by history. Just why such truncated careers have been so much more common during the 20th century than in the past is in itself a question of no small interest, which is larger than the time that I have for it tonight, luckily. But a partial explanation may be that 20th century artists have had both to invent and develop highly individual pictorial languages, and that novel invention has turned out to be less difficult to achieve than sustained development. That is a speculation. Such characterizations as I've just made, that I say have been made of Derain, however, seem to miss a number of important points. For it seems to me that the anomalous nature of Derain's career is interesting in itself, and in no small measure because although he was considered an especially important artist at three distinct phases in his career, his lasting historical significance is generally confined to only the first of those phases. Moreover, Derain's shifts in style are as much a testimony to his willfulness and complexity as they are evidence, finally, of his limitations as an artist. Productive for more than half a century, Derain created a substantial oeuvre and remained stubbornly faithful to his own values, even when he was aware that they were not in accord with what many, perhaps even he himself, considered to be the most essential and historically relevant impulses behind modern painting in general. For a number of reasons, then, Derain's career tells us a good deal about modern painting in general and about modern French painting in particular. The first contradiction, that of Derain being at the center of both Fauve and Cubist painting, seems at first to be especially odd. But upon closer examination, it is explainable in general historical terms and also in terms of Derain's own trajectory as an artist. From our current perspective, it is increasingly clear that, far from being polar opposites, Fauve and Cubist paintings were themselves divergent manifestations of similar desires and similar ambitions acted out in different ways. Both were conceived of initially as reactions against Impressionism and against the realism of what they both called surface appearances. And like Derain, a number of artists were associated with both styles. I refer here not only to the obvious cases such as Braque and Dufy, but also to Matisse. And this is Braque 1906, and Braque 1908, View of Lestat. Braque as a Fauvist, Braque as a Cubist. But also to Matisse, whose painting after 1906 can hardly be characterized as Fauve, and whose underlying pictorial ambitions were for many years similar to those of the Cubists. My first point, then, is that the history of modern French painting is not nearly as categorical as it seems, and that the division of various painters into such categories as Fauve and Cubist tends to undervalue essential similarities between painters who are usually divided into separate schools. In fact, seen within a broader context, it is apparent that between 1905 and 1914, the paintings of almost all advanced French artists had in common a deep and evident concern with the autonomy of the picture as distinct from what the picture represented. Two of the main currents that fed into this new conception of the picture were found in Neo-Impressionism, Seurat on the left, and in Cezanne, both of whom insisted, or the Neo-Impressionists and Cezanne, both of whom insisted, though in different ways, on the autonomy of the individual brushstrokes, which could function simultaneously as elements of representation and as independent structural units. If one were to characterize the underlying ambition of modernist painting in France during the first decade of the century, perhaps the strongest goal, shared by all of its various manifestations, was an unprecedented emphasis on the metaphysical implications that could be expressed by painting in itself, by which I mean the actual handling of the paint. Although this metaphysical ambition was formulated in a variety of different ways, it is a persistent feature of the best painting of the period. It is also a common feature in much of the sympathetic, critical writing of that same period, which, like the painting, emphasizes spiritual rather than material reality and considers the metaphysical aspects of Cezanne's painting to be the most important source of inspiration for the new art. The importance given to Cezanne's historical role at the time was made especially clear by Glaise and Metzinger in their 1912 book, Du Cubism, where they attributed to Cezanne the knowledge of how to, quote, dominate universal dynamism, end quote, and the revelation of, quote, the modifications that simple inanimate objects reciprocally inflict on each other, end quote. Moreover, I love the use of the word inflict in that sentence, inflige. Moreover, within only painters could use a word like that. It has that real bite. In any case, moreover, within Cezanne's painting, there was an essential contradiction that was to have enormous repercussions for the development of later painting, and especially for Derain. While the forms depicted in Cezanne's paintings appeared to be very solid and dense, very much a continuation of the French classical tradition and their emphasis on stability and monumentality, the overall pictorial space of his paintings was extraordinarily fluid and ambiguous. This fluidity, in which solid forms interact with empty spaces, and empty spaces frequently coalesce into visible forms, was considered to be especially modern and difficult for many to grasp. In Cezanne's mature paintings, both solid objects and empty spaces become intermittently undefined. And at those moments of interruption, transition, and interaction, we read the paint on the surface of the canvas as paint per se, as a suspension of physical description. This is especially evident in passages where planes surrender their spatial position to rejoin the abstract pictorial field as incidents of color, or where empty spaces are articulated as edges or planes that also assert the primacy of the pictorial field over what it represents. Cezanne's late style not only emphasizes the interaction between surface and depth, it also assumes a dynamic conception of the world based on the interaction of matter and energy. Technically, this kind of dynamic interaction between different levels of physical being entailed an intricate unity of color and drawing. As Cezanne explained to Émile Bernard in 1904, quote, drawing and color are not at all separate. To the degree that one paints, one draws. The more harmonious the color becomes, the more precise the drawing, end quote. And by the way, in French, he ends that sentence. One remembers that Cezanne started out as a poet, and he ends that sentence in an interesting way. In French, he says, plus la couleur s'harmonise, plus le dessin se précise, rhyming it. Moreover, for Cezanne, the very notion of modeling was closely connected to the even more important notion of modulation. One shouldn't say model, Cezanne remarked, one should say modulate. Cezanne's use of the word modulate here is in itself revealing, in that it implies an abstract musical conception that goes beyond simply rendering things three-dimensionally. Rather, modulation, a musical term associated with movements from one key to another, implies a notion of composition in which individual brushstrokes are conceived as much in relation to abstract systems of spatial, tonal, and chromatic relationships as they are to what they are supposed to represent. This notion of composition implies a synthetic, overtly artificial structuring of the picture, and the use of willful distortion often brought together by strong arabesque-like surface organization of forms, such as you can see here. In such painting, the handling of the paint itself overwhelms to some degree the immateriality of the observed subject, emphasizing instead the artist's complex pictorial responses to that subject. One of the most striking innovations of Cezanne's mature paintings is that our awareness of the visual field, or view, that section of the world which is represented in the picture, is dominated by our awareness of the constant presence of an abstract pictorial field. Although these two may be coterminous, they are not always so. And when they are not, it is the pictorial field rather than the visual field to which precedence is constantly given. In Cezanne's late works, the most forceful sign of the pictorial field is the white ground of the canvas, which you see beautifully sparkling through in both of these paintings, which are from the Barnes Foundation collection. And that white ground of the canvas acts as an energized matrix for the individual strokes of color that come to comprise the picture. Now, during his Fauve phase, Derain directly confronted a number of these problems, and in a relatively short time, between the summer of 1905 and the beginning, more Cezanne, and now Derain, and in a relatively short time, between the summer of 1905, as on the left, and the beginning of 1907, he produced a remarkably varied and original body of work. During this period, he worked first in terms of a neo-impressionist conception of pictorial construction, in which the white of the canvas acted as a source of luminosity into which the colors were set, and I think this is a good example of that, and in which his compositions were built up of small, fairly regular units, as can be seen in Landscape of Callure, summer of 1905. At this time, Derain was acutely aware of the challenges involved in creating pictures that function primarily in pictorial rather than in descriptive terms, that were based on modulation rather than modeling, and in which the decorative arabesque-like surface elements unified the pictorial construction. During the summer of 1905, while he was painting with Matisse at Callure, he wrote to Vlaminck that he was seeking, quote, a new conception of light, end quote, through the negation of shadows and a new kind of compositional expressiveness. Like Matisse, he was also struggling to free himself from the grid-like constraints of neo-impressionist brushwork, which he felt were logical in a luminous and harmonious panel, that's a direct quote, but which hurt, quote, things which draw their expressiveness from intentional disharmonies, end quote. But even then, Derain was wary of what in the same letter he called, quote, a world that self-destructs when one pushes it to the absolute. That's summer of 1905. He spoke instead of seeking a means that would be, quote, the most logical from my personal point of view and be in perfect concord with my means of expression, end quote. Derain first became seriously engaged with this problem in the landscapes that he painted at Callure during the summer of 1905. But as can be seen in Landscape at Callure on the left, the models on which he based his own synthesis were found in Neo-Impressionism and Van Gogh rather than Cezanne. The distinctions between these rather different kinds of pictorial conceptions can be clearly seen by comparing Derain's Landscape at Callure with Matisse's contemporaneous Landscape at Callure, which employs a more Cezannian kind of space. The Matisse painting is not only more freely painted and less finished looking than Derain's, but it also uses the unpainted white canvas in a crucially different way. And the Derain painting, the whiteness functions very much as it would in a neo-impressionist painting, creating a background of effulgent light against which the rhythmically spaced strokes of color are set. In the Matisse painting, by contrast, the white spaces are much more dynamic and active. They seem to interact with the irregularly placed brushstrokes and function as abstract plastic forces that have almost as much presence as the marks of color. This fluid conception of space grows directly out of Matisse's understanding of how Cezanne used the white spaces of the canvas in a forceful structural way. And you can also see that in another 1905 painting by Matisse of Callure. Compared with Derain, the Matisse painting also seems to employ a freer interplay between design and color. Its remarkable fluidity introduces a sense of chance and arbitrariness into its composition, which is in marked contrast to the more static and compartmentalized nature of Derain's composition. Even the colors of the Matisse painting are more arbitrary and only indirectly refer back to nature. Such a painting is less descriptive than one would traditionally expect a landscape painting to be, and it seems to deny rather than affirm a specific time and place. And although the motif itself is a picturesque one, the style of the painting constitutes a denial of the picturesque, that is, in the style itself. Derain's understanding of Cezanne developed rather differently. From the beginning of his career, what Derain seems most to have valued in Cezanne's painting was the solidity and density of his forms, rather than his creation of a new kind of fluid pictorial space. This is especially evident in his early still lifes. And now, unfortunately, I don't have the still life that I wanted to show you, which is a very Cezanne-esque 1904 still life. The slide wasn't made. There was a misunderstanding with the person who was making the slides. So I show you this somewhat later. It's dated 1904 to 1906 painting, which is not as Cezanne-like at all. But you still get some sense, at least. In fact, this, in a way, is one of the paintings that's least like the painting that I'm talking about of all the paintings they say that Derain did during this period. And you can still see that it still insists on solidity a great deal. You'll have to take my word for the fact that the 1904 painting that I wanted to show you is almost as if carved out of stone. It is so solid, and the brushstroke in that painting is much more restrained. And that painting is an homage to Cezanne, and I wanted to show it to you, and I show you this one, to emphasize Derain's interest in the underlying solidity of forms, which would come back again after that brief Fauve period as a reaction to what he then came to think of as the relative formlessness of Fauve painting. Later, during the summer of 1905, however, Derain was able to open up his picture space to a much greater degree and to resist clear definition of the limits of his forms. In paintings like Callure, on the left, he uses the white ground in a more Cezanne-esque way as a ubiquitous matrix which not only keeps the tangibility of the overall picture space in a state of constant suspension, but also mitigates against the coalescing of contiguous forms. Derain's Fauve paintings, like Matisse's, are not stylistically consistent. These are both summer of 1905, for example, probably done within a week or so of each other. They range from neo-impressionist conceptions such as landscape at Callure, or the picture on the left, to relatively flat planar compositions such as fishing port of Callure on the right. And this inconsistency is also seen the following year when Derain paints at the site that was so dear to Cezanne, Les Stacks. These are both paintings done, again, within a very short time in the summer of 1906. Moreover, Derain frequently uses a willfully mixed style, as in Boats at Callure of 1905, which you see on the left here, where different modes of rendering, different kinds of paint application are combined and played off against each other with great skill. This, of course, is something that we've gotten quite used to now, but this is a relatively new thing in 1905. Part of the underlying aesthetic of such painting has to do with an ideal of spontaneity and direct, overtly subjective responses to nature, which is a continuation of an impressionist aesthetic, and with composition conceived in terms of arabesque-like surface unities. Although such paintings also make clear references to earlier landscape painting, they do so almost in an antithetical, anti-picturesque way. If Derain's Fauve paintings are somewhat more literal than those of Matisse, they are much more synthetic, I believe, than those of Vlaminck. In Vlaminck's Fauve canvases, such as houseboat or washboat houses, which we see on the right, painting and drawing are usually treated as separate processes. One frequently has the feeling that the composition was drawn first and then colored in. There is very little real interaction between color, design, and space, and as a result, Vlaminck's compositional structures tend to be quite rigid, and you often feel that his boldness amounts to little more than going rather heavy on the reds and yellows. In this case, the green. In comparison, Derain comes across, I think, as a distinctly stronger painter whose drawing, color, and spatial construction are much more subtle and supple. His compositions are structured in a more painterly way, his picture space is decidedly more dynamic, and he is more resolute in resisting the temptations of the picturesque. This quality of anti-picturesqueness is especially evident in the pictures Derain painted later that year in London. In them, Derain was still relying upon a network of small, regularly applied strokes that ultimately derived from his encounter with neo-impressionist painting. But the massed application of these strokes gives them an extraordinarily energetic sweep and grandeur, as can be seen in Waterloo Bridge on the left. Probably done, there's some confusion about the exact sequence of Derain's two campaigns in London at this time, but it seems fairly firm now that he went to London not in the fall, but rather in the early winter of 1905-6, that is to say at the very end of 1905, so probably almost all of those paintings were painted in 1906, and then he went back again, I believe it was in March. Such a painting can be profitably compared to Monet's paintings of the same motif, Waterloo Bridge, done only a few years earlier. And this is something we sometimes forget. Painting on the left is late 1905, early 1906. The painting on the right is 1903, shown for the first time in 1904. And these comprise a stunning evocation of what might be called the industrial sublime. In paintings like Waterloo Bridge or Big Ben, or Parliament at Night, all done, we'll say, early in 1906. Derain also seems to concentrate on the sublime aspect of what he sees, that awesome aspect of what he sees. But unlike Monet, who implies that the sublime exists within the motif itself, Derain clearly situates the sublime in the mind of the artist rather than in nature. This is apparent in the way that Derain constantly translates what he sees into obviously expressive rushes of brushwork which strongly impose the mark of a temperament on nature rather than creating the illusion that the painting is nature seen through a temperament. It is instructive to remember that at the same time Derain was painting such works, he was also becoming interested in the formal inventiveness of African sculpture, and that these paintings are more or less contemporaneous with his 1905-1906 dance. Unlike Matisse's Bonheur de Vivre, which is painted around the same time and which is almost exactly the same size, Derain's dance is overtly primitivizing and employs a different kind of eclecticism. In Matisse's large painting, the planes elide into each other with a deft fluidity, and the complex references to earlier art are both enhanced and oddly neutralized by the pastoral setting. The Derain painting, by contrast, seems to be set in a tropical jungle rather than a European glade. The figures are more violent and more overtly archaic. There is a stronger sense of action, and the spatial structure is flatter, more frieze-like, and more confrontational. Derain's dance, like Matisse's Bonheur de Vivre, employs a mixed style, but it does so in an even more overt and obvious way, as if to enhance the essential violence of the image through the tumultuous mixture of different stylistic modes. In fact, what is so fascinating about the paintings that Derain did during 1905-1906 is the extraordinary variety of expressive means that he experimented with, in what at first seemed to be an almost random fashion. But at the same time, upon closer examinations, these paintings do seem to veer up and back between flat, arabesque-like compositions, such as the one on the left, and those that describe a rather tangible space, such as the London Bridge paintings of 1906, or Blackfriar Bridge, London Bridge again, and Blackfriars Bridge of 1906, in which I think the tangibility of the drawing is even clearer. And which paintings, the perspective and drawing create an effect of impressive solidity despite the bright coloration. So you've got these two ways that he's painting, the flatter, more decorative way, if you will, and the more designed, more three-dimensional, tangible way. If the slightly earlier London paintings were in part responses to Monet's lyrically atmospheric paintings of the same subjects, Derain's London Bridge paintings, with their insistent perspectival construction and solid modeling, may be seen as an early indication of his movement back toward a more traditional fixed conception of pictorial space. And indeed, shortly after he returned from London, during the spring of 1906, he wrote to Vlaminck that despite his admiration for Monet, he himself sought something else in his painting. Quote, "that which, to the contrary, is fixed, eternal, and complex." End quote. And of course, this reminds one of Cezanne's remark about wanting to redo Poussin after nature. Thus, it is not surprising to remark that the following year, in paintings like Landscape at Cassis of 1907, this is only a year later, color is drastically reduced, and linear perspective is made to play an important, if at times intriguingly ambiguous, role. This shift in emphasis, moreover, appears to have been part of a conscious program. There is a lot to be done in order to proceed in painting, Derain wrote to Vlaminck during the summer of 1907 from Les Stocks when he was painting paintings like these two. Let me start again. There is a lot to be done in order to proceed in painting in terms of drawing, as we have proceeded until now with color. Nor is it surprising that it was the soberly colored paintings he did at Cassis and at Les Stocks in 1907, along with paintings like the Bay of Martigues and Martigues of 1908, that Apollinaire took to be the forerunners of Cubist painting. One of the most striking aspects of such pictures is their obvious Cezannism. But the operative word in this formulation is obvious. For although these paintings make clear reference to Cezanne in their insistent geometry, earthy color harmonies, and even their brushstroke, in a profound way, they are less Cezannesque, or the one on the right in any case, is less Cezannesque than the paintings that Derain had done a year earlier, which used the underlying structure of Cezanne's space, even though their color and drawing were not so obviously Cezannesque. In other words, by 1907-1908, Derain was beginning to move away from a conceptual and structural understanding of Cezanne to a different kind of imitation of him. In fact, Derain's new emphasis on what we might call the more superficial aspects of Cezanne's late style, which is also apparent in his large 1907 Bathers and his 1908 Bathers, coincided precisely with his renewed emphasis on the material solidity of the objects he was representing and on an increasingly static quality in his pictorial space. Paintings such as Derain's Landscape at Cassis and the Bay of Martigues, or to go back to these two Martigues paintings of 1908, masterfully combine a strong sense of surface with an equally strong sense of three-dimensional tangibility. And I think a painting like the one on the left-hand side, not the one on the right, the one on the left, is really one of his strongest works. And did any of you get, just a show of hands, how many of you saw the Derain exhibition in Paris? I think that, to me, the revelation of that shows that these paintings like the one on the left were even stronger than the Fauve paintings in an odd way. There was a kind of really wonderful intensity about them. But at the same time, if one compares these paintings with Braque's Houses at Les Stocks, here's another one of those 1908 Martigues painting, and here's Houses at Les Stocks by Braque, 1908. These paintings then painted the same summer. One realizes how much stronger the sense of a literal view is in the Derain painting, which already anticipates the monumental solidity of works like the famous View of Cadaqués of 1910. This shift into what is referred to as Derain's Cubist phase seems to signal an underlying rupture, even crisis, in his aesthetic as a whole. For unlike Picasso and Braque, Derain's works of around 1910 insisted increasingly upon the sculptural aspects of Cezanne's work and signaled an edging away from precisely the kind of increased fluidity and exaggerated intermittency of description characteristic of the paintings that Picasso did at Cadaqués that same summer. This can clearly be seen by comparing Derain's 1910 pictures, such as View of Cadaqués, with Picasso's Still Life with Glass and Lemon on the right. Whereas the objects in the Picasso painting are subsumed by the shifting planes and fluid spaces that surround and penetrate them, in effect allowing the objects to become more or less eaten away by the pictorial field, Derain insists upon a more monumental, view-oriented picture in which the possibility of anecdotal incident is maintained. Derain's desire to maintain this clear link with material reality and his desire once again to create picturesque landscapes is clearly apparent in the monumental View of Cadaqués, in which the woman walking along the road at the lower left. In which the woman walking along the road at the lower left performs the additionally picturesque act of carrying a basket on her head. Moreover, she is conceived in such a tangible way that she even casts a shadow. In the abstracted space of Picasso and Braque's paintings at this time, such incidents are completely suppressed, in fact, are virtually impossible. Derain's insistence upon materialistic representation is all the more remarkable when we remember that paintings such as this one were done while he was at Cadaqués with Picasso. Hence, his divergence from the increasingly abstract kind of painting that Picasso was moving toward should not be seen as a matter of either slowness or ignorance, but as the conscious taking of a strong counterposition, even as an act of defiance. Derain's paintings of this period also make increasingly obvious references to earlier French and Italian painting. This is especially clear in the Old Bridge at Cagnes of 1912, done shortly after Derain's stay in Cadaqués, in which of 1910 also, 1910 also. Done shortly, that is a couple of months after his stay at Cadaqués, in which his reversion to a more traditional notion of subject matter is especially evident in the way that the woman with the basket, once again on the right-hand side, leads the viewer into the picture space, a device that recalls or even Derain uses the paradigm of Cezannean painting, emphasizing the more traditional, solid, and stable aspects of Cezanne's compositions is instructive. For as we have seen, Cezanne's mature works raise the possibility of addressing the metaphysical not through narrative, but rather through purely painterly means, in effect of displacing the subject matter into the form. Around 1910, these issues were being elaborated on in various ways by painters like Picasso. This is Picasso's view of Cadaqués, by the way, Braque, and Matisse. But Derain was clearly moving in another direction. For although Derain had been very much engaged by such questions during his Fauve phase, by 1910 he was much more intent on stressing the literal physicality of objects, modeling, so to speak, rather than modulating, and on distancing himself from the obvious subjectivity of his earlier works. In fact, the mode of rendering he became involved with in 1910 was one that he had clearly rejected during his Fauve years. However, he had written to Vlaminck in 1906 while he was struggling with the landscape motifs at L'Estaque, quote, "I feel myself to be oriented towards something better, where the picturesque would count less than last year, in order to pay attention only to the question of painting, to make obvious compositions, that is, to amuse oneself by composing pictures like those of Denis, which are of things that one can actually see, is only, in sum, the transposition of a theatrical mise-en-scène. I believe that the problem is rather to group forms in the light and to harmonize them at the same time as one harmonizes the materials of painting that one has at one's disposal." End quote. That's Derain to Vlaminck in 1906. But now, around 1910, he began to take a very different view of the nature and function of painting, one that was very like a theatrical mise-en-scène, and one that began to put him at an increasing distance from the rest of the Parisian avant-garde. By 1910, Michel Puy was already saying of Derain that, quote, sometimes he insists on setting forth in his canvases that which creates the quality of the most archaic paintings, end quote. By 1912, Derain had become so removed from both the Fauve and Cubist milieu that André Salmon, these are both 1912 paintings, remarked that, quote, he lives at the margin of contemporary painting, and I am not sure that his prolonged retreat doesn't produce a negative effect, end quote. In Les Peintres Cubistes, published early in 1913, Apollinaire took the odd position of considering Derain as an exemplar cubist, but tactfully avoided a direct discussion of Derain's work. Critics in the audience will recognize that ploy, saying that, quote, it would be too difficult today to write well about a man who voluntarily keeps his distance from everything and everyone, end quote. In fact, one wonders whether the placement of Derain amongst the Cubists wasn't merely a convenient critical fiction meant to emphasize Derain's apostasy in relation to Fauve painting by associating him directly with Cubism. This is tacitly implied, or I should say actually strongly implied, by Kahnweiler's later characterization of Derain's association with Cubism in 1907 as being directly related to his abandonment of Fauve painting. I quote from Kahnweiler, quote, turning his back on Fauvism, he sees very clearly the givens of the problem that were posed to painting after Cezanne. He addresses them at the same time as Picasso and Braque. What keeps him from succeeding is the entirely retrospective aspect of his vision. His pictures conserve a museum aspect which is not only in complete contradiction with the goal being pursued, but also with the endlessly renewed mission of all painting, which is to recreate the exterior world, end quote. Just how sharply Derain had diverged from the Cubists between 1912 and 1914 is evident in the very different kind of emphasis he placed upon what he had learned from African sculpture, as can be seen in the Offering of 1913 and especially in the exaggerated modeling of the portrait of Itorino of 1914 on the right, which is closer to caricature than to the kind of construction that Derain had associated with African art 6 years earlier, when he had found it a means of finding in nature, quote, the material with which to construct a world of my own, governed not by literal limitations, but by instinct and feeling. And that was a quote that he had given to the American writer Gillette Burgess in 1908. In keeping with the solid and integral nature of the individual objects in his paintings at this time, Derain also began to give new emphasis to overtly symbolical subjects, as in the church at Vers with the cross on the nearby hill, or in Still Life with a cross on the right. In such works, Derain was in a sense disavowing the painterly metaphysics of his earlier works and embracing a more traditional narrative sort of symbolism that recalled early Renaissance Italian painting. It is thus not surprising to find that on the eve of World War I, Derain began to attract support in conservative circles among critics like Louis Vaucel, who regarded those artists who wanted to create an abstract art disdainfully as grade school metaphysicians. In 1914, the conservative critic Gustave Coquillot noted Derain's following among collectors and called him the strongest artist of his generation, predicting that his reputation would outlast those of Matisse and Picasso. Coquillot, moreover, suggested that Derain's stylistic diversity was a strength rather than a weakness, and he began his laudatory essay on the artist with a brief resume of Derain's itinerary that was neatly categorical and implied a kind of pilgrimage toward an eventual enlightenment, and I quote from Coquillot. Derain was a firm Fauve, became a Cubist, then a disciple of Cezanne, then an attentive admirer of African sculpture. Then he evolved toward Gothic sculpture. Notice that he could move from Africa to Europe, which is considered in reactionary circles to be a positive move. Turned toward Renoir through his drawings, and then, one fine day, he went to Rome itself to discover Raphael, end quote. Although the rapprochement with Raphael would have to wait until 1920, when Derain, no doubt reflecting on his doubts about his own position, would call the Italian master, quote, the greatest understood master, end quote. During the 1914 to 1918 war, Derain's traditionalism was seen in an especially positive and nationalistic light. In his catalog text for Derain's 1916 exhibition at the Galerie Paul Guillaume, Apollinaire lauded the very idea of mounting such an exhibition, remarking that, quote, the artistic activity of the nation during the war is an excellent sign, end quote, especially in contrast to, quote, the artistic impotence of contemporary Germany. One doesn't refer either to the artistic activity of Attila's hordes, end quote. Gives you some sense of how high feelings were running. Within this context, Apollinaire found much to praise in Derain's artistic conservatism. Quote, the art of Derain is now imprinted with that expressive grandeur that one can call antique. It comes to him from the old masters and also from the ancient French artists. Notice again the emphasis on the French tradition, particularly the school of Avignon. But easy archaicism is entirely banished from his work. And I guess I should show you the kinds of works that he would be talking about. In the works of André Derain that are exhibited today, one recognizes a temperament that is both audacious and disciplined. And a whole part of his recent work retains the always moving grace of the efforts necessary for him to conciliate these two tendencies. He is close to attaining his goal, which is a harmony full of realist and sublime beatitudes, end quote. In the years just after the war, Derain's reputation rose steeply, partly because of his exemplary military service, which cast him in a positive light in relation to growing post-war nationalism. It should be remarked here, by the way, that neither Matisse nor Picasso had served. André Salmon, who had earlier kept a certain distance from Derain, now spoke positively of the way in which he could not be satisfied by what what Salmon called le Cubism intégral, and how he had, quote, rediscovered the sanguine Courbet and understood his lesson of humanity. Striking a note that would become increasingly common in the years just after the war, Salmon spoke of Derain as the artist who had best been able to balance the risks of excessive naturalism with the even greater perils of gratuitous abstraction. Salmon called Derain's kind of eclectic naturalism one of the most beneficial influences on the young, insisted on Derain's essential Frenchness, calling him l'artiste le plus français, the most French artist, and declared in ringing terms that, quote, Derain is called to triumph in his essential manifestations and also to play the most useful and complete role of mediator or regulator. He is perhaps the greatest French artist of his age, end quote. Salmon's term regulator came to characterize Derain's role at the time. Salmon himself repeated it in a thoughtful article published in 1920, which emphasized Derain's patience, solid French values, and respect for tradition, and it was taken up by the English critic Clive Bell, who held that Derain wanted to, quote, create art which shall be perfectly uncompromising and at the same time human, and he would like it none the worse, I dare say, if it were to turn out popular as well, end quote. In Derain's quest, quote, and this is now again Bell, to create something that shall be uncompromising as art and at the same time humane, Bell saw Derain as standing for, quote, what is today the most vital and valid in France, a passionate love of the great tradition, a longing for order and the will to win it, and that mysterious thing, high seriousness, end quote. Similar themes were repeated by Élie Faure, who had written a very influential, famous history of art and who had written monographs on a number of modern French, contemporary French artists. In his 1923 monograph on Derain, which implicitly criticized Derain's earlier works for emphasizing two-dimensionality and creating an initial effect that was very disquieting. According to Faure, the war had brought a, quote, brusque maturity, end quote, to Derain's art, and allowed him to achieve an extreme expressive concentration. Faure repeats Salmon's characterization of Derain as the regulator and remarks on the presence of an elemental force that emanates from his work. Derain's reputation remained high through the mid-1920s. These are both from 1925. In a 1925 survey conducted by the magazine L'Art Vivant, for example, asking which artists were most worthy to be included in a future museum of modern French art, Derain placed third, behind only, guess who? Matisse and Mayol, and ahead of Picasso, Bonnard, and Braque. Perhaps it ought to be recalled here that Derain was not alone in his response to le rappel à l'ordre, the call to order. Indeed, the work of both Matisse and Picasso, in different ways, had also developed strong conservative strains. Moreover, Matisse's own explanation for why his work had taken such a strong naturalistic turn after the war appeared in certain ways not to be so different from Derain's. Now I work essentially with black and gray, Matisse said, with neutral tones, this is 1919, because I felt it was necessary at this moment. It is very simply a matter of hygiene. If I had continued on the other path, which I knew so well, I would have ended up a Mannerist, as Matisse in 1918, Matisse in 1923 on the right. It is always necessary to keep one's freshness of emotion. You have to follow your instinct. Besides, I am seeking a new synthesis, end quote. But whereas both Matisse and Picasso actively sought a new synthesis during the 1920s, Derain became more deeply entrenched in the retrospective, archaizing manner he had begun before the war. What might have placed him that in fact might have placed him firmly in the academic camp had he already not established his credentials that identified him with so-called l'art vivant, living art. Even his supporters remarked that the quality of his work was becoming increasingly uncertain, and as a result, toward the end of the decade, his reputation began to plunge precipitously. If even relatively successful paintings like Nude with a Cat had verged dangerously close to a banal literalism, the figure paintings of the late 1920s and 1930s were sometimes astonishingly banal, excessively prosaic in their physical literalness, unimaginative in composition and rendering, and increasingly fatuous in their exaggerated facial expressions. The compositions of his still lifes were also sometimes disturbingly dispersed. Now I'm jumping ahead here. This is now to the late 1930s. This is 1938, 38-9. And frequently his pictures seem to lack an overriding principle of organization. Even worse, his paintings of allegorical groups were marked by a sometimes questionable and recidivist archaism. They lack the irony of Picasso's treatment of similar themes or the formal expressiveness of Braque's classicizing figures of the same period. And even among his admirers, it became apparent that Derain's production was being driven to an unhealthy degree by the demands of the market. Although this situation put off, and these are two paintings from the 40s, 1945, just after the war. Let's go back a little. Although this situation put off a number of critics, others stood firm in defense of Derain, or at least tried to. Early in 1930, for example, Clive Bell remarked on Derain's waning reputation, especially among the young, and questioned his own earlier assertion that Derain would be remembered as one of the most important artists of his time. But Bell nonetheless declared that contemporary critics were too hard on Derain, whom he referred to as now as thoughtlessly dismissed as once perhaps he was indiscreetly belauded. And despite his reservations about the, quote, silly, simpering expression, end quote, that's not me, that's Clive Bell, on the faces of some of Derain's nudes, Bell defended what he called Derain's strong artistic personality and pure artistry. By 1829, Adolf Basler, one of Derain's staunchest supporters, and all these people, of course, are major critics at the time, for those of you who are not familiar with these names, took it for granted that, quote, no one pardons Derain for his classical realism, which is only his love of the natural, end quote. Basler, in an introductory text to an album that reproduces only works done after 1913, goes on to say that, quote, trotting out theories that are a quarter of a century old, the critics accuse Derain of imitating the masters, of affecting a virtuosic technique. Basler then criticizes modernist art and theory for having eliminated, quote, all that is imitative in favor of an amorphous spirituality, end quote, which he equates with a confusing intellectualism. In contrast to this, Derain's position is clearly stated. Basler says, quote, André Derain wants to regain the lost objectivity of painting, to renew the tradition of easel painting, which decorative fantasy was about to make disappear, end quote. A sense of doubt, or at least a sense of caution, is evident in a number of the responses published in a special January 1931 issue of Les Chroniques du Jour, which solicited opinions for and against Derain. This was part of a series they had called Pour ou Contre, various artists. Some writers, such as Pierre Courtillon, more or less dismissed the whole of Derain's career. Courtillon wrote, quote, early Derain was perhaps too artistic, the second is too natural. To pick up a brush has become for him a gratuitous act, without surprise and without mystery, end quote. Others, such as Aldré Salmon and Waldemar George, were more equivocal. Salmon gave a brief overview of his past praise for Derain, but refrained from commenting on the artist's recent work. Georges began by praising what he saw as the enlightened aspects of Derain's anti-modernism. Quote, as for Derain, he has ceased to be modern. He has ceased to believe in creative disquietude, that cliché of the avant-garde. His oeuvre is not one full of gratuitous hatred, of savage sedition, of primary destruction, period, end quote. But Georges then took Derain to task because he felt that his various experiments, quote, don't deal with form in itself, with form generator of life, end quote. He also especially criticized Derain's, quote, sense of directly dramatic expression, such as one sees. He wouldn't have been talking about these particular paintings, but in paintings like these, which he said don't belong at all to the 20th century, end quote. At the end of his statement, however, Waldemar Georges returns to the by then standard emphasis on Derain's Frenchness, concern with traditional values, and seriousness, concluding, quote, an often uneven painter, Derain stands for what is today the best in French thought. He demonstrates the highest degree of civilization. He alone holds the secular secret of painting in a permanent way, end quote. If Georges' illusion is an appealing one, it also goes right to the heart of the matter, though not, I believe, in the sense that he meant it to. For the defense of Derain as representing the best in French thought appears to me to be a gross misrepresentation of what the best French pictorial thought has been in modern times. Indeed, it seems to me that what is so disquieting about Derain's career is that he eventually persuaded himself that it was possible to stop time and return to an earlier notion of reality. In his supposed espousal of the grand tradition, he was in effect denying the best of what French painting had accomplished since Monet. To be sure, we can all sympathize with Derain's predicament. It is comforting to think that social and artistic values are actually immutable and stable, and that we can find the underlying norms of that stability in the past. But this is a dangerous and, in the end, counterproductive position for an artist to take. And this it seems to me, was Derain's principal failing as an artist and as a thinker. For painting must indeed reinvent itself by recreating its world and reflecting our world, despite whatever nostalgia and admiration we may have for specific forms from its glorious past. It is this kind of renewal, indeed, that keeps painting alive. And in passing, it might be pointed out that the relative decline of the international reputation of French painting after the Second World War is closely linked to exactly the spurious version of French thought and the highest degree of civilization that Derain tried unsuccessfully to recapture in his late paintings. If there is an object lesson here, it is that what keeps painting from being dead is precisely its capacity for constant renewal, precisely what Derain fought against during the second half of his career. Perhaps it is not merely coincidental that what is arguably the most probing critique of Derain was done not by a writer, but by a painter, and not in words, but in paint. I am referring, of course, to Balthus's 1936 portrait of the artist, which says more about the shortcomings of Derain's brutal materialism, and also about the decline of French painting itself, or I should say the decline that French painting itself was about to suffer, than any written text I know of. Painting is dead only when painting goes dead. This was a phenomenon, ironically, of which Derain himself was not unaware. In 1925, Florent Fels quoted Derain as saying, "What naivete or weakness to speak of the disquiet of contemporary painting. Divine disquietude is the neighbor of all progress," end quote. From our current perspective, one can't help wishing that Derain himself had had more divine disquiet about his own progress. Thank you.